Hi everybody, as promised, here is the start of my YouTube teaching career. I hope we're staying safe and well. Today we're going to be having a look at some of the English literature text, and in particular we're going to be looking at an Inspector Calls. So we're going to be starting with the character of Mr Birling and having a look at his role within the play. We're going to be having a look at Priestley's intentions for this character. We're going to be having a look at how he develops and changes, if he does or if he doesn't, across the text, and ultimately there will be some essay style responses to have a look at the end. Okay, hope it's really useful. Obviously if you have any comments or anything, if you want to add it at the bottom, that would be great. So the first thing I want to talk about really is vocabulary, and looking at how we can describe Mr Birling in a more sophisticated way. It's fairly easy to suggest that Mr Birling is a greedy character. It's fairly easy to suggest that he could be a nasty character. What sets apart candidates who are going to be perceptive, going to be different, is their use of vocabulary in the way that they describe or the way they introduce this character and the points that they're making about him. So on screen now you're going to have 10 key pieces of vocabulary that I'm going to be referring to throughout this video, or the pieces of vocabulary that are going to be useful in your essay style responses about Mr Birling. So your task across the video is, while you're making notes, is to find out what these words mean, think about how they might be applied to the character. Okay, so we're going to consider what's Priestley's big idea with Mr Birling. So what we've got to remember is Mr Birling is a construct. He's been created by Priestley to represent issues or ideologies or events that are going on in his time, and Priestley's using the character of Mr Birling to reflect that. Mr Birling isn't a real person in his own right. This is a construct created by the playwright. Perceptive candidates, what they'll be able to do is talk about the character as a construction, what Priestley's trying to achieve with this message. So when we're looking at Mr Birling, we've got to understand the society that Priestley is living in, we've got to understand the society that Priestley's trying to critique and the ways in which that's happening. So Mr Birling represents that rampant, out of control capitalism that Priestley saw in society at the start of the 20th century. What we have is Mr Birling representing the unrepressed capitalism and greed and selfishness that Priestley saw in day-to-day society. Priestley himself, as we will know, was a socialist, and that means that he believed in equality, he believed in the sharing of resources. Mr Birling is the antithesis of that. He's someone who is grasping, someone who is selfish, someone who is narrow-minded, someone who's myopic in his views. All these sorts of things come together to create a microcosm of the business world that Priestley was seeing at the start of the 20th century. Okay, the first point I'm going to make about Mr Birling is that he is self-assured, he's confident, however he is narrow-minded. And this is perfectly represented in his first of a series of quite large speeches that he does to Gerald and Eric at the start of the play. In that, as is well known, he describes the Titanic as unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. He also declares that the Germans don't want war. These two phrases are really, really useful to be able to remember and to be able to refer to. The Titanic, an interesting metaphor that Priestley's using here for the entirety of the capitalist society that Birling believes in. If you take this metaphor further, have a think about the Titanic and think about what that might represent. A ship filled with luxury, considered the grandest of its age, is sunk by something undermining it, something that caused it to sink. Likewise, the First World War, the Germans don't want war. Who is Mr Birling to be able to make these grand statements? We know at the end of the play, one of the inspector's final lines is, "In fire and blood and anguish." This is revealing to us as an audience that the inspector's point of view, the inspector's way of seeing the world, is much more realistic than that of Mr Birling. Next point we can consider is Mr Birling's obsession with status and his role within society. He sees himself as one of the most important cornerstone figures of Brumley's social circle, and he constantly references this throughout the play. We have references to the fact that he feels that he's in line for a knighthood. He references fairly consistently his role as a magistrate, his previous role as an alderman, all of these roles within society which are ceremonial. He sees himself as a powerful and important figure. However, we can also consider Mr Birling as someone who is very insecure in himself. It's hinted at within the stage directions at the start of the play that Mr Birling is newly acquired his status. His wife is described as his social superior. One of the first interactions that we have with Gerald, Mr Birling is seen to be saying it's what your father likes. He seems to be copying the mannerisms and the way in which the Crofts behave. Later on in the play, he again reveals his insecurity in the fact that Gerald's mother feels that he is married beneath himself. So Mr Birling is consistently doing this to try and demonstrate to the audience, to the inspector, to the people who will listen to him, that he is a powerful figure. This is further reflected when he tries to intimidate the inspector. He says that he regularly plays golf with the chief inspector. This is all to do with intimidation. This is all Mr Birling trying to get across his social status, his power, and his obsession really with the way that other people view him. One of Mr Birling's most famous lines within the play is where he describes himself as a hard-headed, practical man of business. Now, this is Mr Birling's philosophy at its absolute peak. Mr Birling sees himself as a man who has a responsibility to business. He sees life only getting better, and he sees no problems with the way that he's behaving. At the start of the play, as he's lecturing Gerald and Eric, he describes that society is in a time for steadily increasing prosperity, and the inspector, when he comes to challenge him, looks at how he uses young women like Eva Smith as cheap labour. Mr Birling sees nothing wrong with this. He embodies these capitalist values. He embodies this abhorrent greed, this selfishness, and the need to take. This is perfectly referenced by the inspector when Mr Birling says that if you don't come down sharply on these people, when he's referring to the women who went on strike, they'll soon be asking for the earth. And the inspector retorts with, it is better to ask for the earth than to take it. Mr Birling is representing these wider issues of societal greed and selfishness within his own business. Mr Birling primarily sees himself as an individual. He sees himself as someone who has to look after himself and his own and has no wider responsibilities to society. This is perfectly encapsulated at the start of the play. Midway through one of his large speeches to Gerald and Eric, he says a man must have to look after his own and his family, and at that point the inspector interrupts him. Now this is significant as the inspector is breaking through Mr Birling's beliefs of this idea of man cannot live alone. Likewise, Mr Birling describes community and all that nonsense. He describes us as bees mixed up in a hive. He cannot see the wider links that he needs with society, and the fact that he is very selfishly only looking after himself. This is further emphasised when he describes socialists and the views that socialists hold as cranks, like the inspector, suggesting that their beliefs are completely unaligned to his own and completely irrelevant. Furthermore, when challenged on these views, Mr Birling suggests that he cannot accept responsibility. He cannot see how something that he did would have any consequence or effect on another member of society. He tries to reason with the inspector by suggesting that if this was the case, things would become very awkward. However, the inspector is there to challenge Mr Birling's views, to break him down. Ultimately, one of the most striking things about Mr Birling's character is his complete inability to learn or to change throughout the events of the play. After the inspector leaves, his first line to Eric is, "You're the one I blame for this." Completely dismissing all the ideas of community, all the ideas of us all being linked and being members of one body, that every small action will have consequence. He cannot see how his actions have caused this chain of events. Likewise, as soon as an opportunity arises to dismiss the effect that he has had, when Gerald returns with the understanding that the inspector is not a real policeman, Mr Birling declares that it makes a great deal of difference. Not the consequence, but the fact that it's not a real policeman. Likewise, he's very, very quick to jump on the idea of this being a hoax, or by jingo, a fake, as this will reveal to him, that he can absolve himself of any responsibility, and his abhorrent and despicable behaviour has no consequences. Ultimately, this does come to a conclusion with that final ring of the phone call and him returning with a downtrodden expression to that we're going to be asked some further questions. But ultimately, what Priestley's trying to suggest is the older generation in the play have little or no intention of changing their behaviours. Okay, I hope that's been a useful introduction or reintroduction to the character of Mr Birling. What's going to appear now is a series of essay questions, of which you've got a choice. The first two questions are going to be more of an introduction, more of a getting back to grips with the character. The second set, a bit more challenging, will require a little bit more thought, a little bit more processing, a little bit more of a development of an argument. If you'd like to either produce an essay plan about how you'd go about approaching these questions, or if you'd like to prefer to write it, then by all means, if you could email me that would be lovely. Good luck. Seeing as though we are in lockdown, I'm going to be ending each video with a short film recommendation, just to keep us going. So today's film recommendation is one of the greatest films ever made, which is The Dark Knight. It's a fantastic story, and don't be put off by the fact that it's a superhero movie. If anything, it is more of a crime epic in the style of The Departed or Goodfellas. The opening bank heist sequence is one of the best things I've ever seen put to cinema. It's a good way to kill 2.5 hours, that's for sure. Okay, till next time, stay safe.